The views expressed on the Midvale Main Street Theater podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Midvale Main Street Theater, its owners, advertisers, or volunteers.
Shut up and listen. I look back at some of my proudest moments in my theater career and see parts of these performances and think to myself, what the hell are you doing? Ultimately, if you were to ask a reviewer, I think that's what they would say they review shows for, to help us. We as performers necessarily have to give these companies some form of trust that they will come to the show with an open mind and heart and take an honest look at the shows we produce. I would like to talk about when reviews go wrong. Reads to me like, at the very least, he didn't care about giving a good review, and at most wanted to slander the show and the theater and make them both sound like garbage to anyone reading the review. You know that reading words like this, they would absolutely be devastated. If it weren't for that criticism and using it in the right way, I know for a fact I wouldn't have continued theater. And I also know for a fact that if that criticism wasn't just, within context, and most of all fair, I wouldn't be where I am today. Line! You guys, sorry, just had to give a little shout out to any Office fans, or I guess any Fat Albert fans out there. Welcome back to the Midvale Main Street Theater podcast. My name is Michael Howell, and let's just go over the news we have for this week. Okay, so the first thing is that at time of recording, Addams Family Young at Part is set to open tonight at the Midvale Main Street Theater. I'm going to be there tonight. I'm sure that everybody in the cast and crew is so excited to get this open and to share the show with everybody. Obviously I have the fortunate position to be married to the choreographer, one of the choreographers, I should say. And, I've just heard about how much time and effort and energy and love that these kids have put into this production. I'm just so excited to see it tonight, and I'm so excited for them to open and hopefully have an awesome run. So break legs, everybody listening that's in the cast and crew and everything like that. I'll see you tonight, and hope you have a great one. Okay, and that's really the only bit of news from Midvale Main Street Theater proper. But I did mention in the last episode, and I've been putting out on Facebook and everything like that, I really wanted to get you guys involved and see what's going on in your life and celebrate your accomplishments, celebrate any roles you're getting or shows you're doing or whatever else. And I did get a response from Bria. You may remember her. She was Heather in American Idiot just recently at the Midvale Main Street Theater. And she wrote in, and this is what she had to say. She says, just chilling in NYC, getting ready for my first show here and missing the American Idiot cast like crazy. So yeah, very cool, very exciting. She's in New York City, going to college right now, but she has a big show in New York City. I actually saw a clip of it on her Instagram, and it sounded like it went great. So very cool. Congratulations, Bria. I also wanted to mention she has a song out on iTunes that she has recorded and everything in college at the moment. So go check her out on iTunes and grab that song because it's great. She sounded great at her show, so congratulations. And with that, just wanted to remind you again, if you have any news or anything else you want to have mentioned on the podcast, go ahead and message me, comment on these Facebook posts, email me at mmstpodcast@gmail.com, whatever, even record a voice clip, send that over to me and I will put it on the episode. Let's celebrate each other. I think that would be awesome. Okay, so yes, that's all the news. Now on to the actual episode. This episode is another experiment for me. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately that have these longer essays, just kind of discussing things relevant to the audience or whatever else. And so wanted to try my hand at one for sure. If it goes well, I will absolutely keep doing these. I had a lot of fun writing it and a lot of fun researching everything. So it was very cool. I just wanted to kind of set a couple things up before we go into it. I understand that this is an hour-long podcast of me just talking into the microphone, which may get, a little draining on some people or whatever other word you want to use. So I'm going to put the the timestamps in the show notes of the podcast. It has an introduction, 3 sections, and a conclusion, kind of like a high school essay or whatever. But I'll put timestamps for all of those in the show notes, so you can break it up into those segments if you'd like, skip around if you want to, whatever else. Just so you're aware of that. Finally, and I did pre-record the actual essay. I am recording this little news section a little later. Did want to mention, again, you'll hear this a bunch in the actual essay, but this is a little bit of a controversial thing. I definitely voice my own opinion. The views expressed, again, are mine alone and not Midvale Main Street Theater's. So please, if you have any, problems with what I'm saying or have anything you want to discuss with me, whatever else, please send it my way rather than Midvale Main Street Theater's way. We may get a little controversial. So again, this is only me. Any hate, bring it on. Bring it to me, not to Midvale Main Street Theater. And, kind of going along with that, if you have any response to it, either positive or negative, please, send it to me. I would love to, put your voice and your opinion on this episode. You can either, like I've said, just write it out and message me, send it to my email, whatever else. But I would love, honestly, to have you record your own opinion so I could put it on the episode itself. You can even just do that on your iPhone. Just send a voice memo to me or whatever else. It's super easy and super convenient now to send audio back and forth. So, why not take advantage of it? Let me know what you think. Tell me off. I will put it on the podcast episode. I promise. I should say I promise with a caveat, if it is completely vulgar and, not appropriate, or if it is too long or whatever else, I can't do that, unfortunately. But yes, keep it on topic, I guess, rather than vulgar or whatever else, and keep it short, and I will put it on the episode, I promise. Okay, and without further ado, I now present a new type of episode at the Midvale Main Street Theater podcast, a first in a new series I am calling Monologues, and this one is called On Reviews. So, this week's episode is yet another experiment for me. Back in the day, I used to write a blog on, a semi-fairly kind of sort of consistent basis, and honestly, I had a lot of fun with it. These blogs, which you can actually find at dreamtalking.weebly.com, were usually just my, rantings and ravings for the week, and in a way, that's what this week's episode is going to be. My thoughts. That's it, plain and simple. That's how I want to preface this episode. The opinions included are mine alone and do not reflect the thoughts and feelings of anyone else, whether that be Midvale's owners, volunteers, advertisers, random people on the street in front of the theater, or even my wife's opinions. I'll have to make that distinction a couple times this episode, so please bear with me. I also wanted to mention that since this is an opinion piece, I would be more than happy to hear back from you guys on this. I'm probably wrong with a lot of what I'm saying here, so please let me know if I am. You are more than welcome either to write me, either on Facebook at MMST Podcast, or by emailing us at mmstpodcast@gmail.com, or you could even record a response yourself. Just send me a downloadable MP3, and as long as it's, appropriate enough and not too vulgar, whatever else, I promise you I'll feature it on the show. I'm not one to think my thoughts are perfect, so I would love for you to show me exactly how wrong I am. And finally, I'll post an entire transcript of this episode on mmstpodcast.podbean.com with, a couple rewrites to make it flow better in a written form. So that way, if you want to carve up my dissections, you're able to. With all of that out of the way, let's go on to the episode. So, in trying this new format, I really hemmed and hawed for about a half an hour with how I'm going to start this thing. You guys have heard by now that starting episodes or even just normal conversations is not my strongest suit. I thought of all the cute, clever, cliched, and vomit-inducing ways I could think to start this episode, but in the end, I settled on something a lot more real and a lot more personal to me. Something that I know that 99% of you listening will have at least felt inside yourself at some point in your performing careers, or even as a supporter of a performer. I want to talk about reviews. So in early 2013, I was feeling pretty good about myself as a performer. I'd played major parts in both Charlie Brown and Rent at Midvale Main Street Theater, and had some minor roles in Avenue Q and even Little Mermaid Jr. Oddly enough, I'd absolutely felt like I'd found my home at the Midvale Main Street Theater. It was a place where all my friends were, really, where I could go, and no matter what mood I was in or anything else, I would absolutely feel welcome and comfortable. I'd overcome some challenges both personally and on the stage, and felt like I was the best performer I was going to be. And boy, I couldn't have been more wrong. The proof of that was actually coming up here shortly with the next production in Midvale's 2013 season, Legally Blonde. I didn't know much about Legally Blonde before getting cast, honestly. The funny thing is that I'd actually seen it on Broadway about 3 years before 2013, when Midvale was doing it. But the group that I was in was in the back row of the highest balcony of this big old theater on Broadway. So it was more like watching dolls do the show rather than people. I didn't really remember most of the show. I still don't remember most of the show. I remembered it was cute and it had some funny moments, but I didn't run out and buy the soundtrack or anything. It wasn't a show for me. So when auditions rolled around for it at Midvale, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd done minimal research, at least for my standards, on the show, beforehand, and came into it not really knowing what to expect. I'd put on the audition form that I was interested in Emmett just because I knew he was the biggest male part in the show. I also knew full well I could never play the part of Warner, obviously. So anyway, once I got that amazing email just asking me to play Emmett, I kind of panicked. You see, in high school, and even community shows up until that production, I'd never played a romantic lead. It just wasn't me, I was always a little too short and a little too fat and a little too unattractive to play the romantic interest, which honestly was fine. In high school, my senior year, we did shows like Grease, which I could never play Danny in, obviously. We also did a show called The Rules of Comedy, which is just kind of a slapstick humor kind of show. I got to play a big part in it, which was awesome. And by the way, just a little side note, I found out that Jason Campbell's school is doing it sometime this year. So go see it. It's an awesome, funny show. And then, the final show that I did at Brighton High School was a show called Yearbook the Musical, which is, a big old ensemble kind of show in which I played a very convincing jock. But still, I didn't have any romantic kind of storyline or anything like that. I just never needed to be the hot, charming guy in any of those. And then even here at Midvale, I played Mark, who's someone whose girlfriends recently dumped him, and Charlie Brown, who was literally written to be unfortunate looking. So I didn't need to have any type of romantic charm or charisma up until then, and now I was getting thrust into this part that needed a whole hell of a lot of it. And honestly, I knew pretty early on into the rehearsal process that that charisma wasn't there. No amount of watching YouTube clips and trying to imitate Christian Borle was going to help me, fabricate this charisma that the role called for. I knew it. The person opposite me knew it, and I'm pretty damn sure that everybody in the cast did too. So you can imagine on opening night, when all the reviews are scheduled to be there, I was feeling more than a little bit nervous. You see, I've always prided myself on at least trying to be a good actor. I knew I was a serviceable yet somewhat forgettable singer, and I knew that I was getting put at the back of every dance number for a reason. So I also knew that if I were to get anywhere at all in performing, I knew it had to come from acting. It's just the place that I had, I guess, the most control over, So going into opening night, I was feeling nervous. I kept telling myself that if you can at least be passable as someone this character in Elle Woods would fall for, you have done your job. You've done your job and you can move on. So that's what I tried to do. Just, again, copy Christian Borle and at least pass. And that was my mindset going into reading the reviews for the show as well. So the first couple reviews were honestly pretty good. Broadway World Utah and even the Deseret News had both published bubbly reviews that really focused on the women in the show, which, honestly makes sense. They were absolutely incredible in this show, but Brianna Lindsay of Front Row Reviewers was even nice enough to mention me. She said this, quote, "I was amused by how relaxed and laid back Howell's performance was. Howell was easy to watch and connect with, especially during Emmett's duet with Elle, showing the course of their blossoming friendship over the semester. I found the subtlety of the character to be refreshing in comparison to many of the over-the-top performers in the production," close quote. Which was nice, and honestly a lot more than I was expecting. I thought I'd gotten away with it, knowing full well I had only tried to be passable, and I thought I'd done that. But then a couple days later, an audio review of our show was published. It was published by a group called Entertainment Blogcast, which some of you listening might perk your ears up at, and I'll get to that little twist in a second. But anyway, this group had 3 reviewers come out to see the show, then had made a podcast episode dedicated to reviewing the show. I was definitely intrigued, even just, as a podcast listener, but I listened to it as soon as it went up. So, the first reviewer was more than nice about me, saying she, quote, "would be lying if she said that she didn't leave with a tiny little crush on Michael Anthony Howell's nerdy awkwardness as Emmett," close quote. But that was it, which is fine. It was great. But then the other 2 reviewers were up. The first one, named Aaron Montgomery, said, quote, "there were character connections I didn't get. Elle and Emmett never really felt in love, to be honest," close quote. And the other reviewer, while saying some nice things about me as well, to be fair, agreed with Aaron and said, he and Elle were kind of spotty when it came to their relationship. There were some times where I really believed they were into each other, and then there were scenes where it wasn't as strong, close quote. And the weird, funny twist to that story, that second reviewer was a man by the name of Jeremy Heaps. Now, don't think I'm trying to say anything bad about Jeremy, or Aaron, or anyone who's ever given me a bad review. Let me explain why I would never badmouth a critical reviewer. Once I heard those reviews, I was devastated. It hadn't worked. My plan to imitate an actually good performer had backfired, and I knew it. It's never a good feeling to get a bad review, ever. But there's nothing quite like knowing that this bad review is absolutely 100% right. I knew that I hadn't put in the effort and that I was half-assing what I needed to, and as a result, myself and the other performers and the show as a whole had suffered. I didn't feel good at all. After listening to those reviews, I, definitely tried to kick up the rest of my performance, up a notch, but overall, looking back on that show, I know that I shorted myself and was not living up to the performer I wanted to be. It felt wrong. I almost felt disgusted with myself. I vowed I would never, ever let another one of my casts down like that again. So I say all this to bring up another show I was a part of at the beginning of 2015. It was a little show called The Wedding Singer. I again had the amazing opportunity to play the romantic lead of Robbie Hart in the show, something that honestly I wasn't expecting but couldn't be more excited for, because I knew that now I had a chance to make up for that subpar performance I had turned in Legally Blonde. In many ways, the characters in those 2 shows are similar. They're somewhat awkward characters that are supposed to have the cute charm and charisma that pulls the girl away from the more attractive guy. And I told myself I was going to do it right this time. And honestly, who knows if I did. Unfortunately, that show wasn't reviewed at all, but ultimately, I'm very proud of that performance. I'm proud of it because while it may not be the crowning jewel of my performing career, I don't know if I'll ever feel perfectly comfortable playing those type of roles, but, I knew that I had given my all to that performance. And honestly, I don't know if I would have cared to try and get better unless I had gotten those negative reviews I had from Aaron and Jeremy. I don't know if I would have just tried to do an Adam Sandler impression or a Stephen Lynch impression, without getting that negative feedback. So, to this day, those reviews are something that I count as a defining moment in my quote-unquote performing career, and something that has undoubtedly made me a better performer. So this entire story, I hope, kind of serves as an at least decent setup for what I wanted to talk about today, reviews. Something that, depending on where you're at or which production you're working on, it's either kind of a life-affirming blog post or a four-letter word within a cast. Reviews are such a big part of our performing lives, aren't they? You know, we work and we work and we work sometimes for months and months for a little, couple sentence, if you're lucky, comment about your performance in a show, which I think for us on stage, it kind of validates something, doesn't it? As much as we say we're not doing this for the applause or the praise, we all kind of are, aren't we? So these reviews, good or bad, become a huge focus for us once the show opens. They also serve this weird purpose with theater companies themselves, They have to walk a fine line between promoting a show and giving an honest criticism of it. You don't want to piss off the theater, but you also want to give an honest review. And finally, I've never been a reviewer, of course, but I know that as a reviewer, you must be in such a weird position. You've more than likely been on stage before. You've seen what happens behind the scenes and know how hard it is sometimes to get a great performance out of a cast. You know all this, and yet you still have to dissect a show and, point out some of the bad parts of it. A weird place to be, honestly, for sure. So yeah, the purpose of this episode is to examine that balancing act of reviews. I want to take a look at, what performers owe to the reviewers that come out to see us, what lessons theaters should take from reviewers, and what reviewers owe to us as performers and as audience members. Now, I have to say this once again so no one gets in trouble. The views expressed are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Midvale Main Street Theater, its owners, performers, volunteers, audience members, ghosts that haunt it, or the rats in the alleyway outside. It's a bad side effect of calling this show the Midvale Main Street Theater Podcast because, in spite of this name, I have to be very clear that anything I say doesn't reflect on the rest of the Midvale family. In fact, I may get some shit from them for what I'm going to say in this episode, so just keep all that in mind, and keep in mind that these are all my opinions, and any hate you feel from it shouldn't be directed at anybody else but me. Please and thank you. Now let's move forward. So, first question, what do we as performers owe to reviewers? It's sort of an odd question because right up until we open, reviews in particular aren't really something we're thinking about. We may think about the audience in either a healthy or unhealthy way, and obviously want to give the audience the best show that we can, and that would, of course, include any reviewers in the audience. So I guess what I mean more than anything when I say, what do we owe reviewers, comes after the review has been published. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, Michael, we get it. You're not supposed to be an asshole about it, and move on. Next topic, please. And in a sense, you're right. The first thing any performer should do is just to stop. Literally stop whatever train of thought you immediately go down. Just stop and listen or read or whatever, and don't think about that negative. This applies, honestly, to pretty much everything about criticism in theater in general. Music director is telling you that you're off pitch, just shut up and listen. Stage managers telling you you're fucking up your traffic pattern to get a set piece, shut up and listen. Your director is giving you a note during notes. Shut up and listen. Honestly, that's my biggest pet peeve. When an actor doesn't shut up and tries to justify something after they've been given a note. This is not the time or the place to justify or ask questions. Please wait until the director is done with all of her notes, then go talk to him afterwards. No one gives a shit. No one gives a shit about your justifications. Fix it after the fact. Sorry, I digress. This should absolutely be your first step. Just shut up and listen. Take a second to understand where the reviewer's coming from, read the entire review, then start the response process. I've seen plenty of instances where an actor could have responded negatively to a review from a paragraph at the top of the article without even realizing all the praise they're getting later on in the article. It's also possible that this reviewer was taking notes at a time where a confusion they had or something would have been answered on stage. They're just bending over and writing their note. So there's a whole shitload of possibilities that could affect this review in particular. So instead of disregarding the review altogether, we need to stop, take a second, shut up, and take the entire review in. From there, we need to evaluate that feedback that we just got. Is it justified? Or, more importantly, can you see how this could be justifiable? There is a distinction there. If you answer yes to either of those questions, there are chances are there are things that you can learn from that review. Going back to my Legally Blonde experience, I knew full well that criticism I got was justified, and I was already feeling what they were saying. I was just trying to hide that shortcoming behind the mask of another person's performance. However, by that same token, I've also got plenty of feedback from sources I didn't find justifiable. For example, before Ryan disabled the YouTube comments on our Rocky Horror Show recording, I was just slaughtered by people online. There's no other way to say it, people saying I didn't look like Riff Raff, or didn't sound right, or didn't have the right tone of voice, or that I couldn't hit the notes, and everything in between. Now, to be fair, most comments online where your name isn't attached to your account tend to be more insulting and less constructive than most. I think we all know that. But I had found that most of the comments on that page had also commented on other people's Rocky performances online with a lot of similar remarks, So in this instance, I'd say 90% of those comments about me I just discounted as unjustifiable. These people were trying to make an apples-to-apples comparison of our show with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, something that they've probably seen 100 times, and held any kind of departure from the movie up to the flames. And sure, to each his own, but as a performer, I want to see something new. Anyway, that other 10%, the ones who weren't just calling me fat or saying I didn't sound like Richard O'Brien, I could learn from. I learned that some of the riffing, no pun intended, I chose to do in that show didn't really fit the tone of the show overall, and I also found that some of the character moments could have been amplified. They just didn't read right or whatever else. So no matter where the reviews are coming from, we need to listen and to evaluate them. And from that evaluation comes the final thing we need to do: act on it. May seem like a simple thing, but it's the biggest part of this. We need to take these just criticisms and make yourself better. I've seen far too many people disregard what a critic may say about their show or their performance and just keep on keeping on with their lives. And honestly, how arrogant is that? To say that this criticism isn't something I need to work on is to say that you have all the acting, singing, or dancing answers, and that you have no more room to grow, which for every single performer out there is entirely untrue. There is always, always, always something you can improve upon. I look back at some of my proudest moments in my theater career and see parts of these performances and think to myself, what the hell are you doing? I remember a specific instance in Rent, which honestly I consider to be one of my better performances, and I just watched myself do this weird, whiny kid thing and shoo Roger away with my arm, in the song Goodbye Love, and it almost makes me laugh. At this big part in the show that's supposed to be one of the most dramatic, I do that, and I watch myself do that, and it kills me. But, is also something I know that I can improve on. Making real and honest and not stupid choices, definitely an improvement I can make. Ultimately, if you were to ask a reviewer, I think that's what they would say they review shows for, to help us. It's usually, I'll put that in a little parentheses, usually not to hurt us or to, place us in some kind of weird performance pecking order, but to help every single person in the cast and crew to be better at what we do. And isn't that what we all want anyway? I can't think of anything I'd like more than to see Utah's performing arts community get better and better every year. And reviewers are a great way to do that. Which transitions us into the second question we had about this whole reviewer question, I guess. What responsibility, if any, do reviewers have to the theater companies themselves? Again, it's another odd question, and I think it's kind of born from this weird relationship reviewers and theaters essentially must have. Think about it. A theater invites someone into their theater, gives them free tickets, wines and dines them when they get there, and tries to give them the best experience possible, knowing in the back of their mind full well that this reviewer could metaphorically bend down and take a big old shit all over this show that they just put weeks or months of work into. I'm sure there's at least a couple theaters out there that kind of look at this situation and the setup and think, why in the world would I want to do that? But by that same token, I'm sure that reviewer, I should say, you'll feel this pressure as soon as you walk through the door. There must be some nervousness and guilt associated with getting those free tickets, not even speaking to how weird it must be to potentially know somebody else in that cast that you're reviewing and knowing they'll know who you are if you give them a poor review. So looking at that and looking at it from both sides, why would theaters even want this to happen? And that can be answered with one word: money. These reviews, at least I would assume in the minds of the theater companies or owners, must serve as a way to get the good word out about their show, right? To be fair, I don't own a theater company, haven't spoken to any owners about this topic by any means, but, if we think about it and we follow it to its logical conclusion, that must be. It's an easy way to have like a third party not associated with the theater or the production in any capacity come in and say a good thing about your show, which you can then use to share the good word on Facebook. Potentially, this validates buying a ticket in the eyes of some of your potential audience, So in that regard, it makes sense to give this reviewer a free ticket until the negative review happens. Negative reviews, as discussed before, when not taken in the right way, can be a cancer on a cast and crew. I've seen instances of casts taking a negative review and letting it severely harm the production's run. I, of course, am not going to talk specifics here, but even some shows that I've been a part of have let these reviews kind of fester and ultimately let them harm the chemistry that the cast has built on stage and off, to be fair. So that, combined with losing potential ticket sales, must sometimes make the prospect of a reviewer coming to see you in your show a hard sell to these owners and directors. And honestly, I can't blame them. I've never directed or even seen the books for a show or anything, so I honestly couldn't say what a negative review does to the bottom line of the show. But what I do know is that ultimately this entertainment thing that we do, it's a business. And it's a business that relies on marketing and good word of mouth in order to continue to be a business. So no, I don't blame them. It makes sense to me that they need to meet their financial goals in order to proceed. And maybe what we need to, as a community, need to do at this point then is to kind of have a change in perspective. In Utah, I can think of three main places where I see my shows, at least, being reviewed. Those three are Front Row Reviewers Utah, Utah Theater Bloggers, and Broadway World Utah. So I think at this point, it might be worthwhile to take a look at these three and their approach to reviewing to see if any compromise can be made. Maybe with that compromise, we can figure out a way to make those reviews more helpful for the theaters they review for. So first, Front Row Reviewers. Possibly, and I can't say for sure, but possibly the most well-known blog. If you've been doing shows, at least for a little bit here, you've probably heard of them. If you look online between these three blogs, Front Row Reviewers has the most reviews by far. I unfortunately couldn't find really many total estimations or anything online, but just by looking at their theater reviews tab on their website, you can see that they review from Box Elder County all the way down to Iron County. I've read somewhere on their site, and I can't find it now, but I did read somewhere that their goal is to review every show in the state if possible, which honestly, I commend them for. To try and see as many shows in the state as you can is definitely not a small achievement, and I can tell that so much work has been put into what they do. It's inspiring to see that level of dedication, and I thank them for it. But if we're looking at these reviews honestly, which I've been trying to do this whole episode, I think to myself, these guys must have an easier time getting in the door than most. After all, part of their mission statement says they will always look for the positive To quote them, we are reviewers who support theater in Utah, and we are not interested in tearing a production down, sounding pretentious, or in any way being mean. We do want to encourage productions to do their best, and may highlight a production's weak spots that could be improved, but we will do it in a kind way. Close quote. That was from their About Us section online. Now, when a theater sees that quote as part of their mission statement, they're of course going to welcome this review company with open arms, Having a review company that will lift your cast's morale and while at the same time potentially bringing in ticket sales, it seems less like a win-win and more like a win-win-win for everybody. Little office quote there for everybody listening, but we do have to ask once we look at that, is it really a win-win-win? Sure. A review that focuses on the good and could potentially skip some areas for improvement, may let actors and crews enjoy reading the article, but that'll be it, No one will really grow from that review, will they? Going back to my Legally Blonde experience, if I were to have just received those written reviews that I was talking about and not Aaron and Jeremy's feedback, what would I have done as a performer? I can't really say for sure, but I think that I would have stagnated in that area of my acting talent. I wouldn't have tried to turn in a better performance next show. I wouldn't have looked myself in the mirror and told myself, you have to change. Now, to be fair, some FRRU reviews lodge some complaints about the shows some of the time. For example, take my friend Cindy Whitehair's review of American Idiot at Midvale, which just happened not too long ago, but her review, while overwhelmingly positive, did have a negative thing to say about the show. She wrote, quote, "The biggest flaw of American Idiot is probably the lack of a real plot. The book does not do a lot to transition you along between songs, so if you don't know all the words to the songs used, you will be a little lost. While the synopsis in the program helped, it is hard to follow along with a synopsis in a darkened theater." Close quote. Which honestly is a fair assessment of the show. Due to the nature of that show, some of the people will definitely get lost in the story taking place on stage. But that was all she had to say as far as a negative about the show. Which, to be fair, honestly may be how she felt, but looking back on the show myself, and keeping in mind how fucking proud I am of that production, and the cast and crew and everything, there were definitely still areas in the show that could have been improved. Watching my performance alone, I had things where whatever I was doing on stage and feeling just didn't read like I wanted it to. But even beyond what I can see, what if there are other things that I, as a biased member of the cast, can't see? And what if we keep making these mistakes in the future? Next, we come to Utah theater bloggers. Now, these guys are an enigma to me. I have to remind everybody listening that what I say really has no evidence or solid backing other than the impression that I have as a performer that's been doing this for the last 7 years. I haven't spoken to any theater owners or anyone at Utah Theater Bloggers about this at all, so please take what I'm saying with a huge grain of salt. So, Utah Theater Bloggers used to be where I first went to get theater reviews. Back in my quote-unquote early days as a performer, the 2012, 2013 era, it seemed like all I was seeing were Utah Theater Bloggers reviews being shared. I believe, I can't be for sure, but I believe they were the first to publish a review for Rent, my first community theater show ever. They also had reviewed shows of Midvale's and even shows from other companies that had performed at Midvale, just rented the theater or whatever. And honestly, to me, they seemed like the top dog of the reviewing community here in Utah. I was always excited to see Utah Theater Bloggers' review of my show because at the time, it seemed like they were doing what I've been saying these reviews should be doing this whole time. Taking an honest look at shows and not only praising, but constructively criticizing, shows in order for everyone to grow. So, for example, in Andrea Fife's review of Rent, the one at Midvale that I was in, she wrote, quote, Lighting, designed presumably by Tammy Ross but uncredited in the program, seems sporadic, with characters moving in and out of the light at distracting times. In La Vie Boheme, characters would step out of the light as they stood on the tables during solo moments. In other instances, such as scenes between Roger and Mimi, which frequently took place just right of center stage, it appeared that they had taken one step further to the right, their faces would have been lit. The light often reflected off the edges of the scenes, distracting from rather than supporting the acting." Close quote. Now, again, to be fair, as I'm trying my damnedest to do in this episode, if you haven't noticed, I've heard Tammy say that some of the lighting issues in her earlier shows were simply just due to the limitations of the theater, at the time. But you better believe that she's taken that criticism and improved her shows because of it. I contend that nowadays, Midvale has some of the best lighting in the state. Just go watch American Idiot on YouTube and tell me that I'm wrong. So again, this is an example of a good reviewer pointing out areas Midvale could improve on, and possibly partly to do with this review and others, Tammy saw that weakness in her shows and has since turned it into one of the strongest parts of her shows. Sounds great, right? It was. For a couple years, I was happy with the relationship that everyone had, but then something happened, and honestly, I'm not really sure of the details on it. So looking at UTB's website, I see that the last Midvale show that they had reviewed was Spring Awakening. The first Spring Awakening, back in 2014. Something must have changed around that time, because as far as I can tell and can remember, we haven't had another Utah Theater Bloggers review since. To be fair, doing some research on their website, I did see an interesting section in their FAQ section of the site, which reads, quote, "We have a limited number of theater companies that our schedulers contact for permission to review their productions. These companies include the equity theater companies in the state, the summer theater festivals, the leading semi-professional companies, and most colleges and universities. We expect other theater companies that want to review to contact us and initiate the process. We cannot guarantee that we will review every production we are invited to, but we make a sincere effort to find a reviewer every time." Quote, close quote. So my question is, why the change? Why go from including places like the Midvale Main Street Theater, the Empress, Sandy Arts, or places like that in your regular rotation to having them on the outside looking in? Now, all this being said, if you don't want to go review shows at a certain theater, cool, that's fine. No one can tell you what you want to do with your reviewing company, Hell, and for all I know, some of these theaters have asked you not to come review at their theaters anymore, which, again, they can do what they want to do. I think it'd be a bad thing for these companies to do so, but to each their own. I'm not a director or a producer or whatever, I just think that whatever the case may be, it's important to ask this question. Do reviewers owe anything to the performing arts community? Should they feel any obligation to make an effort to review as many productions as they can, like Front Row does? And to be honest, I don't know if I have a good answer. Right now, I'm honestly leaning toward no, they don't owe anyone anything. All I know is that me not getting a review from Utah Theater Bloggers in the last 4 years, it kind of feels weird to me, and almost makes me feel like the productions that I've done aren't up to standard or whatever else with what UTB usually reviews in their eyes. Which, I'm sorry, just isn't true. I think that there are so many productions at the community level here in Utah that can rival anything you'll see on an equity stage. So, while maybe not an obligation, it might be something reviewing companies may need to consider going forward. Now, the last company I'd like to talk about is Broadway World Utah, which, I honestly didn't even know if I should include with these other two. They're not something I really have much background on. I know they're attached to a big Broadway World website, a national website, and, therefore have a bunch of national news and seems to focus on more of the bigger theaters here, Eccles and that kind of thing, which is fine. I don't think us as performers really show much interest in their website anyway, at least until the end of the year polls come up, which are problematic in their own right, but not something I'm going to talk about here. I did want to bring them up for one specific reason, though, which I'll get into later, but ultimately, looking through their reviews, it seems to me like they're kind of following the Utah theater bloggers' approach to reviews, focusing on the bigger theater companies in the state and possibly going down to the community level if they're asked to. I won't go back into what I've said before. Suffice to say that while they're not one of the bigger sites I go to for reviews, it's still just a weird feeling to see places possibly picking and choosing which theater companies are up to standard for them, Now, as for that compromise, the question that we were asking with this section, honestly, I'm going to leave it up to you, the listener. I have a couple of my thoughts about this, and I'm sure you guys have already figured out what they are, but I think there's definitely a discussion to be had when it comes to reviewers and theaters. Should we ask for criticism as actors, knowing full well it may not be in the theater's best interest, Should theaters be willing to get negative reviews that may allow growth long term but hurt the show's bottom line? Good questions, Let me know what you guys think. Now comes the fun part. Question 3. What responsibilities do reviewers have to the actors and crew members of the shows they review? Now, you'll notice I didn't include any qualifier of if any in this question, because reviewers undoubtedly have a responsibility to the people that have put in the time, put in the effort, put themselves in front of a big old crowd every night in order to try and give them a good show. We as performers necessarily have to give these companies some form of trust that they will come to the show with an open mind and heart and take an honest look at the shows we produce. Not a biased one, not one that's going to protect us from any criticism, but one that will give us a fair shake, It's funny because while I was researching for this episode, I noticed that both Front Row reviewers and Utah theater bloggers say essentially the same thing. Quoting from Front Row Reviewers' website here, quote, "Because we're actors ourselves, we know what it takes to go to countless rehearsals, learn lines, miss your family, wear uncomfortable costumes, and sometimes work with people that are hard to be around. We have empathy for those involved in productions and commit to showing that empathy in our reviews." Close quote. And then from Utah Theater Bloggers website, quote, "The Utah Theater Bloggers Association is a nonprofit organization comprised of a group of theater patrons and professionals dedicated to the creation and support of theater in Utah. We're local theater lovers and practitioners just like you." Close quote. Now, Broadway World Utah doesn't have an about section or the like, so I couldn't include anything like that from their website in this episode, but I'd imagine they'd feel the same way, right? It makes sense that you would love theater and in doing so know what goes into rehearsals, what goes into a production, and at least hold yourself up to that standard. We as actors have to trust that you will do so, and for the most part, I think Utah-based reviews have done that. Take for example another one of Cindy Whitehair's Front Row Reviewers' reviews of the revival of Spelling Bee at Midvale. Throughout the review, she says things like, quote, "These characters are all so dynamic and different, and the cast members really do an amazing job drawing those characters out," close quote. And continuing in this review, she says, quote, "You can hear all the actors well enough to wonder, were they mic'd or not? And when you hear feedback, is it intentional? Ever heard kids handle a hand mic, It's painful," close quote. Clearly, she knew the show that she was getting into. She understood the content, the characters, and the vision for the show. She gave a shit to know that, too. She came into the review wanting to give a fair review and gave one. To be fair, this again was another Front Row Reviewers review, so there's a possibility that some criticisms she had didn't get published, I honestly couldn't say, of course, but I commend her for knowing her shit, keeping it in context of the show, and writing a solid, well-thought-out review. That's what we should expect from a reviewer. That's what I've seen, for the most part, when I've seen shows reviewed. However, there's an ugly flip side of that coin. Something I may get into a lot of trouble here for. They're the reason I included Broadway World Utah in this episode. I would like to talk about when reviews go wrong. Now, before I continue, I'd like to remind everyone yet again that what I'm about to say is my opinion and mine alone. What I'm saying without counseling anyone else. No one here at Midvale, no one in the cast or crew of Spelling Bee, whatever. This is me, and any hate you may have as a listener needs to be directed at me alone. Again, Facebook at MMST Podcast, mmstpodcast@gmail.com. You can reach me and let me know what you think. I say all that because on January 14th, 2018, by far the worst review I've ever seen was published on Broadway World, Utah. This review was written by a man named Blair Howell, someone who I think I've only met once in my life. I don't even know if that was him or not, honestly, but obviously I don't know him well at all. Can't say if he has any kind of motivations or whatever else have you, but all I have is the evidence in the articles that he posted online. So if you go to Broadway World, Utah and read some of the reviews he's posted, you'll start to see an almost hateful pattern in the way he writes. For example, in his review of the Empress's production of Ghost recently, he wrote, quote, Ty Whiting's costumes are unconvincingly patterned after New York City-ites in the what can you pull from your closet vein, close quote. Which, of course it is. The Empress Theater operates on a much smaller budget than some other theater companies, and therefore does the best with what they have available. I know Ty Whiting personally, and I will say right now that that man is a genius with costuming, especially within the confines of his smaller budget. Blair obviously cares little to not at all about the context in which these productions are mounted. But I'm getting away from the point. This review, going back to it, published again on January 14th, 2018, was of Midvale's production of Spelling Bee, The Revival. The same show that I was talking about, which Cindy Whitehair reviewed and I quoted earlier. Now, laying all of my biases out on the table, I wasn't a part of the production of Spelling Bee in any way. I unfortunately wasn't able to see the production. All I really have to judge this review off of was knowing the show, knowing the theater, knowing the cast, and knowing the crew. Also, just a weird little side story to this before we go on. Keep in mind, while you're hearing this, that Blair asked to come and review the show. He was a willing participant to this whole thing, making sure he was the one to see it and review it for Broadway World Utah. So, with all that in mind, I'm going to read this entire review for you right now. Now, you may be saying, I don't want to listen to you just ramble off a review right now. Well, don't worry, because this review, quote unquote, is about the third the length of a standard review. So, here we go. In the words of Blair, quote, "We are the slightest bit bizarre," sings William Barfay in the 25th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. At the Midvale Main Street Theater production, director Tammy Ross moves the action smoothly along as each middle school Spelling Bee champion's individual quirks and oddities are revealed. The cast interacts well with each other and is earnest in their portrayals. Audience members have a good time with the musical staged, primarily because they were apparently composed primarily, nice double use of the word primarily there, by the way, of enthusiastic friends and family members on opening night. A few actors give winning performances of the awkward years of adolescence designed in Spelling Bee. As the hormone-driven Chip Tolentino, Tommy Kaye impresses with his ability to combine innocence and burgeoning sexuality. His character's song ends the first act with hilarity, despite the misguided, uncontrolled chaos of pandemonium. Along with the other mishmash clothes, the uncredited costume designer has confusingly selected a Boy Scout uniform for Chip. Riley Jensen skillfully develops her character as the neglected Olive Ostrovsky, whose mother is in an ashram in India and her no-show father has failed to pay the $25 entrance fee. Olive appears to blossom before our eyes as she gains more confidence with her wordsmith skills. Her sincere "The I Love You" song is a high point. As the Bee director, Rona Lisa Peretti, Hannah Ross Kelly is appealing. Each my favorite moment of the Bee is a favorite moment. Other performers miss the slightest bit bizarre script instruction and cartoonishly overplay. The worst offender is Micah Taylor as Leaf Coneybear, generally the most appealing role, but he plays the role as an alien from the planet Weirdo. Partly to blame is his bozo costuming, which would lead anyone into insanity. It was ill-advised for Taylor Lawrence to add a ballet obsession to her character. There was misdialogue with inarticulate pronunciation, along with monotone delivery of Jordan Dixon as Vice Principal Douglas Panch. Any vocal prowess developed by music director Hannah Hales is completely undone by the poor sound system. Once a solo hits a certain volume level, the sound is muffled and distorted. Close quote. And that's it. That is the end of the review. I'm being serious. No mention of the show dates, where it's playing, or when the show starts. Just ends with one final zinger at the theater sound system. I'm going to try and keep my cool as I break this review down, I promise, but please bear with me if I can't, because this review is honestly the epitome of what I'm talking about right now, and let's break down why. In the first paragraph, he starts fairly well. He mentions Tammy's direction being smooth and highlighting the cast's oddities really well. He'll go on to contradict these statements later in the review, but, if we're taking this one line at a time, so far, so good. But then the next sentence, he says, quote, audience members have a good time with the musical staged, primarily because they were apparently composed primarily of enthusiastic friends and family members on opening night, close quote. Which seems like such a cheap shot, low blow, huh? In one sentence, completely discrediting any talent, comedic timing, or effort in literally any of those performers on stage. First of all, to make any kind of assumption on audience composition is bullshit, unless you know everybody, every single person in that audience. Second of all, literally every audience in the state will at least have a couple people in the audience that are there to support friends or family. That's obviously a big part of why people go to shows. Third, once again, are we really supposed to assume that any and all laughs and applause are just for pity? Have you read that script? Spelling Bee is probably the funniest musical I've ever seen. So take 10 people who've never acted in their lives and have them read the script, and you'll still be rolling on the floor. Finally, once again, to assume that the laughter was not the result of the 3 or 4 months in rehearsals, let alone the countless years these performers have been honing their skills in comedic timing, is truly insulting. Something that you should be ashamed of. Something that all the reviewers in the state should be aware of, no matter what talent level these performers are. Not to say that these actors aren't amazing and talented, because they are. You should never, ever take their hard work for granted. It's low, shows your ugly bias toward the production, and something to be ashamed of if you do this. Moving on. His next paragraph talks about Tommy Kaye's portrayal of Chip Tolentino, and for the most part is positive, and well-deserved, I'm sure. Tommy's incredibly talented and is a very hard worker. However, at the end of the paragraph, Mr. Howell blatantly betrays his willful unpreparedness with this line, quote, along with the other mishmash clothes, the uncredited costume designer has confusingly selected a Boy Scout uniform for Chip, close quote. So, have you read the script, Blair? Have you seen literally any picture of this character in any of the productions that have come before this one? In doing the quickest of Google searches of character description spelling bee, here's what the first 2 results say about the character of Chip. On BroadwayRose.org, it states, quote, an athletic social Boy Scout, and champion of the 24th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee, close quote. And on education.seattlepi.com, it reads, quote, Chip Tolentino is the previous year's champion. He is Filipino, has long black hair, and wears a Boy Scout uniform, close quote. The lesson here for reviewers, know the show you're going to see. Ignorance just doesn't look good on you. Every show is going to have its oddities and quirks, but rather than dismissing these as some kind of shortcoming on the production, maybe take a note and research it after the show's over. Or better yet, just know the show going in. Not doing so just makes you look foolish. Moving on, we see a paragraph dedicated to Riley Jensen and Hannah Ross-Kelly and their portrayals of Olive and Rona, respectively. I'm sure in his praise, he's right here. I've heard great things about both the performers, and while I haven't ever seen Riley Jensen perform, I have heard Hannah sing, and she's phenomenal. So, great job giving at least these 2 the praise that they're due. Next paragraph is where things start to get weird. Not in a silly way, but in an almost clearly malicious way on the part of Mr. Howell. This is very obvious in lines such as, quote, The worst offender is Micah Taylor as Leaf Conybear, generally the most appealing role, but he plays the role as an alien from the planet Weirdo. Partly to blame is his bozo costuming, which would lead anyone into insanity, close quote. And just not bothering to mention anything about Taylor Lawrence and Jordan Dixon, two amazing, awesome actors, other than, quote, "It was ill-advised for Taylor Lawrence to add a ballet obsession to her character. There was missed dialogue with inarticulate pronunciation, along with monotone delivery of Jordan Dixon as Vice Principal Douglas Panch," close quote. I apologize if I stumble on these. He's not the most articulate writer. The lesson here for reviewers? Give the credit where it's due. I didn't get to see Taylor as Logan, unfortunately, but I've seen her perform, and I know that she's killed it. I don't have to have seen the show, I just know that she killed it. Also, Jordan Dixon played Vice Principal Panch when I was in Spelling Bee at Midvale, and I know that he consistently had the best laughs in that show. No one missed his lines. They were all super funny, mostly improvised, crazily enough, and in that performance, he literally stole every single one of the performances out from under the rest of the cast. Also, why did we forget to include more than half the cast in the review? I understand leaving a couple names out as a necessity, but just skipping them altogether seems lazy and wrong. Now, I can't really say that Mr. Howell had any kind of bad intentions or anything going into this review, but reading this paragraph and him omitting very obvious praises for the show, as well as failing to mention plenty of the cast, reads to me like, at the very least, he didn't care about giving a good review, and at most wanted to slander the show and the theater and make them both sound like garbage to anyone reading the review. And finally, he ends the review with some stupid cheap shot about the theater's sound system. Something that Cindy Whitehair praised in her review, so who knows. Now, when I first read the review, I honestly thought it was a joke. First of all, the word count jumps out at me. Looking now, his full review has 344 words, and in reference, his review of Ghost had 489 words, and Cindy's review of Spelling Bee had 1,004 words, so way too short to fully review a show. I understand in today's world, shorter is usually better, but I'd say you need at least 700 words in order to truly review a show. So, this review is certainly lacking in content. The other thing that made me think that this was a joke is his, how shall we say, use of colorful phrases such as bozo costuming and alien from the planet Weirdo, using phrases that were very clearly meant to insult the cast and the production. You should be ashamed of yourself, Mr. Howell. If I didn't know any better, I'd think you'd have no idea how hurtful and harmful these words could be. But I know that your son's a performer. I would think that because of this, that reading words like this, coming from what some would, possibly see as an educated opinion, which you clearly don't have, but they would absolutely be devastated, especially performers who may just be starting to explore their creativity. That's the whole point of this little rant. Reviews should be about fostering creativity, talent, and enjoyment in what we do, and you, sir, with your embarrassing review, may have killed growth within this cast and the other casts you have no problem putting down. I can't say for sure that this is the case, but what I can say is that this review did nothing to harbor any kind of growth or creative expression with this cast. You may think of yourself as some kind of reviewing savant, which you clearly thought about while you were writing these reviews, but maybe we need to take a step back and think about why we review and why we perform. I'd like to close this little rant with another story of mine, so please bear with me. It's not very long, but back in 2008, I was fortunate enough to be cast in Brighton High School's musical review, You Can't Stop the Beat. It was an awesome show, written by kids in the production class, which was awesome, taking a whole bunch of songs from a whole bunch of shows. Written into that show was the part of Leaf Conybear, ironically enough, and I miraculously got cast as this part. And I was petrified. I was a junior. I had only had parts in Brighton's ensembles up until this point, so having speaking lines and even singing, I'm not that smart, in the show itself was probably the scariest thing I'd ever done in a performance. During rehearsals, I tried and tried and tried, but no matter what, I always was getting notes from the director, Phaedra Atkinson, at the end of the show's run. So no matter how these notes were delivered, compliment sandwich, whatever, I was just devastated after every run. I remember one night hanging back after rehearsal while everyone else had left and going up to Phaedra, holding back tears. I said, "Thank you for trying to work with me, but I can't do this. Please give my part to someone else." And I was serious. I couldn't do it anymore. I had just taken all of these notes and constructive criticisms in such a terrible way and just felt my creativity completely vanish. So I say these things to Phaedra. She does something amazing. She leans down to me, gives me a hug, and tells me, "Michael, you're going to stay playing this part. Do you know why I give you all these notes? Because I can see in you that you have it. And I'm pushing you every single day to make sure you know you have it too." From there, I went on to perform over the couple weekends or whatever it was that was the review, and I loved every second of it. I found new things to try and got some laughs and had some misses, of course, but ultimately I grew so much as a performer in that review. And if it weren't for that criticism and using it in the right way, I know for a fact I wouldn't have continued theater. And I also know for a fact that if that criticism wasn't just, within context, and most of all fair, I wouldn't be where I am today. That's the point here. I'm not trying to stir anything up, as unbelievable as that may sound. I'm not trying to be controversial for the sake of it. I'm wanting us to all take a look at the role that these reviews have in our performing lives. They're such a dreaded thing sometimes when they really shouldn't be. A well-written review has the power to transform you from a good performer to a truly great one. A well-written review has the power to make theaters take a good look at possible shortcomings and transform into a venue that spits out high-quality productions time and time again. A well-written review has the power and responsibility to foster growth and change within a performer and within a person. And a poorly written review has the power to crush those things. Performers, let's make a promise not to be afraid of a critical review. Let's promise to take these for what most reviewers want them to be, a tool for growth. Theaters, let's promise to be accepting of all reviews, including negative ones, so performers and production crews have the chance to hear these thoughts and learn from them. And reviewers, let's promise to promote a nurturing, healthy culture and not tear down anyone, show, theater, or company. Let's make sure we know our shit going in, leave any bias at the door, and give praise where it's due and constructive criticism where needed. Utah's theater community can only grow if we do so. Thank you guys for listening. Once again, if you'd like to add anything to this conversation, I'm more than happy to either read or play on this podcast your responses. I would love to hear from you. Even you, Mr. Howell. If I'm wrong about any of this, you tell me. You let me know. If you agree, let me know as well. I would still love to hear from you guys. That all being said, until next time, we'll see ya. As always, the Midvale Main Street Theater podcast is sponsored, funnily enough, by the Midvale Main Street Theater. Check out new and exciting updates on everything going on at the Midvale Main Street Theater by going to www.midvaletheater.com or check them out on Facebook and Instagram at Midvale Main Street Theater. You can find show notes and much more by going to our podcast's Facebook page at facebook.com/MMSTpodcast. Special thanks to Ashley Howell, Joel Clark, and Matthew Petrucci for help making this show happen. I owe you guys the world. I've been Michael Howell, and this has been the Midvale Main Street Theater podcast. The views expressed have been mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Midvale Main Street Theater, its owners, or volunteers. If you've liked what you've heard today, please consider finding the Midvale Main Street Theater podcast on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or whatever podcast listener you're using and dropping us a 5-star review. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at MMST Podcast. Thank you very much, and until next time, we'll see ya.